Well, hello everybody. Welcome back. It's good to see everybody. All my friends are here and some others. Today we've got Nora, Rhodes, John Baxter and Martin Graebe. A lovely, excellent lineup as always. Our next Zoom meeting like this will be on the 31st of October. So you can't go out Halloweening because you're going to be here with us. Where we have Sam Richards, Bob Strom and Derek Piotr. I think that's how you pronounce his name. 3 people that we haven't heard from before. So that's the 31st of October. Can't forget that day. But before that, this coming Wednesday, the 20th of October, we've got a special evening for the official launch of Martin's book, Forgotten Songs of the Upper Thames, songs from the Alfred Williams collection. So that's a joint meeting between ourselves and the ballad partners who have published the book. So please do come along on Wednesday. It's at 7:30. You have to book a ticket. Either Martin or I will put a link for it in the chat if you haven't booked on Eventbrite as usual. It'll be the same old thing really, except for the fact there will be some singing as well as slides and talking heads like Martin and myself. And that's on Wednesday. One other bit of news is that we're not getting up to 100 attendees at the moment since we got back after our break. We sell about 78, 80 tickets. So we don't need to stream on YouTube. We started that because we were getting over the 100 that Zoom allowed. So as from this meeting, we'll just go back to the Zoom presentation and then YouTube afterwards. So if you want to see on YouTube, you'll watch afterwards. If that really disenfranchises you and you hate the idea, if you're watching this on Zoom and you can't do without it, then please email us and object. But unless anybody squeals, we'll be stopping the YouTube live stream. Everybody got that? That's good. So straight into the sessions, we're going to start with Nora. We've heard from Nora before, and she always gives us a really good presentation. So no pressure, Nora. Over to you, Nora. Don't forget to unmute.
Okay, thank you. All right, let me share my screen. Okay, hold up. Okay. Can everybody see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. All right. So in 2020, I received a Henry Reed Fund Award from the Library of Congress to work in one of the most important single singer collections held by the American Folklife Center, that of Emma Dusenberry. Arkansas professor Robert Cochran wrote that her life is a great saga of a singer who lived and died in poverty and obscurity, even as she awed her better known and better healed listeners. And I'm very happy to share some photos and recordings and tell you a little of her story today. Over a century ago, in the southwestern Arkansas mountains, lived Emma Dusenberry, an elderly blind widow, and Ora, her slight, timid daughter. Their home was a remote shack where Mrs. Dusenberry kept a scruffy black dog, a cow, a few laying hens, and an enormous store of mountain songs and tales. As a young woman, she'd set herself to learning all the songs in the world, and, true to her word, she continued to gather ballads and other folk songs throughout her years of itinerant and impoverished living. Emma Hayes was born in Rome, Georgia in January 1862, but her family moved to Rabun County before moving to Arkansas in 1872. She recalls taking a steamboat across the Mississippi to meet her grandfather, who took them by ox wagon to a homestead in Baxter County, where she stayed from ages 10 to 18. Here is a little of Emma's play party version of London Bridge, which she sang for John Lomax in 1936. Those are her hens in the background.
Take a by the right hand till I love her, oh girl, remember me. Take her by the right hand, tell her I love her, the prettiest girl I know. Hug her neat and kiss her sweet, oh girls remember me. Hug her nice and kiss her twice, for the prettiest girl you know. Will that do?
Emma learned nearly all her first songs in Baxter County, and on many of her recordings, she names the relative or neighbor she had a song from 50 or 60 years before. She recalls early Sunday morning gatherings, saying, "We could hear the singing a long way off in those days, and when I got down the road a piece to where I could get the sound, I didn't hardly hit the ground until I got to the church door. I was so happy I couldn't walk, I just run." Here she is singing "We Will Camp Upon the Mountain."
We will camp upon the mountain, we will camp upon the mountain. We will camp upon the mountain in that great day. Oh, Israel, oh, Israel, oh, Israel, in that great day.
She also took to the play parties where the young folks gathered on Sunday evenings. They sang and told riddles until it was time to go home and milk. Here she is singing "The Chimney Sweeper." Emma tells John Lomax how she discouraged a boy who tried to kiss her by shoving him clear across the room, and about the sweethearts she had, one for every Sunday on the month, after singing.
Yes, and one of your own choosing. We have no time for to be losing. Join your right hand, this bloom, step over and kiss the lips of your own choosing.
This is one of the play party songs, the old play party songs, isn't it, Miss Dusenberry?
Yes, sir.
Well, how did you play it?
Well, they seated themselves all around the room, and one young man would get a broom and have another young man follow him, and they'd march around the room and sing, and then this young man that was following the one with the broom in his hand would go and choose a girl, and then they'd join their right hands and step over the broom, and then they'd kiss.
Well, did you ever play that game?
I played the game, but I told the young fellow that went with me that if he undertook to kiss me, if I played the game with him, that he would never go with me anymore, and I'd have no more to do with him. And he just said no, and went on, and was playing that play, the Chimney Sweeper, and we stepped over the broom, and he undertook to kiss me, and I just took my hands out of it and just shoved him clean across the room. The family went to the front door. Maybe you think they didn't like it.
Well, what is that boy's name?
Sam,
Was Sam a nice boy?
oh, yes, sir, he is a nice boy and well respected.
One of your sweethearts?
Yes, sir.
Did you have a good many sweethearts when you were young?
Yes, sir, I had one for every Sunday in the month.
At about 18, Emma moved on her own to West Marion County, where she nursed the sick for her board and $1 a week. A year or so later, she married Ernest Dusenberry, an itinerant worker from Illinois. Ernest loved music as much as Emma and often fiddled while she danced or sang. As Emma relates, he liked to sing and liked to hear others sing too, and we just rambled around, and when we got tired, settled down for a spell. I've done a lot of rambling. 2 years later, they had their daughter, Ora. Sometime within the next few years, Emma suffered a serious illness that left her blind. Yet she and Ernest continued their itinerant life for 2 decades. Ernest worked railroads and packing plant jobs, and the whole family picked cotton in the late summers. In the evening, the family turned to music and dance. Here is a bit of Emma singing "I Have a Father in the Kingdom."
I have a father in the kingdom. I have a father in the kingdom. I have a father in the kingdom. He's sitting on a seat with Jesus. High up in heaven to sit on a seat with Jesus.
In 1907, the Dusenberry settled on a small farm outside Rocky, a remote Washita Mountain community in Polk County, about a mile northwest of the town of Mina, where they hoped to scrape a living. But farmers' times were hard, crops were poor, and 10 years later, about 1917, Ernest was thrown from a runaway buggy and crippled for life. His health continued to steadily decline for another 15 years. These years brought the Great Flood of 1927. About half the crops failed in 1930, and worsening droughts continued throughout the Depression. It was also during this time that Emma's treasure of songs became her strongest asset and visitors began to arrive, each traversing the Washitas in all weather. The collectors usually came in pairs, seeking the blind old woman way back in the mountain woods. As one recounts, they drove 10 miles along the brown-bouldered and clay-rutted Mill Creek Road to find her. Emma's storehouse of songs first came to the attention of faculty at Commonwealth College, a progressive labor college established just north of Mina in 1925. Emma and Ora brought blueberries and handicrafts to sell to the students. Emma soon shared her songs and stories as well. The student drama group, having discovered that Emma was a veritable anthology of mountain folk music, invited her to sing at their Saturday night shows, and attendance always increased on those nights. F.M. Goodhue, a Commonwealth teacher with a strong interest in ballads, took to visiting Dusenberry, recording and learning her songs, and reached out to Ozarks scholar Vance Randolph. Randolph became the first important collector to visit Dusenberry in November of 1928. Here is a clip of her child number 84, Barbara Allen, which Goodhue learned from Emma and Randolph later published.
Was in the merry month of May, when the green buds were swelling, sweet William lay on his deathbed for the love of Barbara Allen. He sent his servants to her hall, he sent into her dwelling, my master's sick and sends for you, if your name be Barbara Allen.
Randolph said that he saw lots of pretty hard-up people when he was working in the mountains, but did not think he ever saw anybody worse off than the Dusenberrys were. Randolph not only collected songs on that first visit to Emma, but returned a number of times over the next several years. He included Emma's songs and folk tales as well in his journal articles and books, remarking that she knew more ballads than anyone else in the Ozarks. 16 songs in his 4-volume collection, Ozark Folk Songs, were gotten directly from Emma, while another 12 are attributed to her. Most of these are included in the British Ballads volume of Randolph's Ozark publications. Randolph declared Dusenberry the best ballad singer he had ever met. This is a bit of her version of a classic Scots ballad, child number 10, The Twa Sisters, which she calls the Beaver Hat.
First he give her the beaver hat, both she bent to me. First he give her the beaver hat, the oldest sister did not like her. I'll be kind to my true love, if you'll be kind to me. And next he give her the gay gold ring, low down, low down. Next he give her the gay gold ring, both she bent to me. Next he give her the gay gold ring, the oldest sister not afraid. I'll be kind to my true love, if you'll be kind to me.
Although Emma's music was becoming known, her personal hardships increased. In 1933, her husband Ernest died. Emma and Ora did their best to get by, selling eggs, picking cotton for neighbors in summer, gathering edible plants and medicinal herbs, and stretching out their widow's pension and relief money. But while most of Emma's surviving recordings were collected during the next 3 years, she and Ora became increasingly destitute. In June of 1934, Pulitzer Prize-winning Arkansas poet John Gould Fletcher came to see Emma. His account of that visit was published by T.S. Eliot in his London journal The Criterion in October 1936. It began, "Ever since the day I heard for the first time, but not the last, this song, sung in a leaky-roofed, decaying cabin by an old, blind, illiterate woman dressed in flour-sack clothes, whose repertoire consisted of nearly 100 such ballads, I, too, have regarded the Ozarks as a magic land." The ballad which so struck Fletcher was an early and unusually complete version of child number 68, Young Hunting. Dusenberry, who was then 72, recalled learning it in Jefferson County, Missouri, in her late teens. Dusenberry told Fletcher that, "When I was a young girl, all the songs I knowed were camp-meeting tunes and hymns and such like, but when I got older, I learnt a lot of ballads, and they just naturally drove the others out of my mind." Clearly that wasn't true. This is a bit of her Lord Banyan, as Emma no doubt sang it for Fletcher.
Lie down, Lord Banyan, you said, and stay all night with me. In a forest lady, you know Scotland would look this night for thee. I can't lie down, nor stay all night with thee. For the forest lady in old Scotland is a-looking this night for me.
The next year, Fletcher, who returned several times between 1934 and 1938, brought his friend, Little Rock composer and symphony director Lawrence Powell. Powell's interest, but not urgency, was piqued by Fletcher's account of Dusenberry's repertoire, to which Powell replied, "If Miss Dusenberry can sing 200 folk songs, I don't think she'll go to the devil if she does kick the bucket before we can get at her." After visiting with her, Powell wrote, "Miss Dusenberry knows more Arkansas folk songs than anyone else in the world, and is a valuable resident of Arkansas and the nation, not only for her songs, but for herself." Like Randolph and Fletcher before him, Powell's own pursuits were inspired by Dusenberry. He transcribed and published a collection as 14 American folk songs and based the final movement of his symphony, An American Rondo, on several of them. Although Fletcher and Powell's planned book of Dusenberry's songs was never realized, their manuscript of songs collected between 1933 and 1936 is preserved at the University of Arkansas Special Collections in Fayetteville and the American Folklife Center. Here's a bit of Lonesome Scenes of Winter, one of the songs included in Powell's symphony.
The little birds sing sweetly around on every vine. My heart would go a-sporting if Mary would be mine. Last night I went to see her, she appeared most scornfully. I asked her if she'd marry, she wouldn't consent to me.
Powell invited Dusenberry to sing at an important Arkansas Centennial celebration in Little Rock. He brought her to the Fair Park Festival himself and wrote a feature article which appeared in the Arkansas Gazette, along with Emma's photo. Powell also wrote of Mrs. Dusenberry to John Lomax, then honorary consultant and curator of the Archive of American Folk Song at the Library of Congress. And so they came, with the library's recording equipment, turning off the muddy fourth-class highway at her mailbox to follow some wagon tracks marking a dim trail through the woods to her shack. There they stayed for 2 days in the heat of August 1936 to visit and conduct a marathon recording. Like everyone before him, Lomax was greatly impressed with Emma and wrote in his autobiography that she sang almost continuously and recorded more traditional Anglo-American ballads than any other singer. He minded, however, that she spoiled her recording of The Brown Girl by refusing to remove a nesting hen from the cabin. Lomax returned to the library with 18 acetate discs and 81 songs. Here is a clip from the end of Lomax's recording of Emma singing Pretty Fair Miss in the Garden. You can hear Emma remark with amusement that the returned lover said that he wouldn't have married anyone else just because she had said she wouldn't marry nobody else.
He picked her up all in his arms and kisses he gave came to my single soldier that had just returned to marry you. Don't you remember the promise I made you before I went to the sea? And if I'd stayed there some years longer, not a girl on earth could have married me. He said that just because she wouldn't marry nobody else.
During these years, the resettlement administration was also collecting folk songs to boost morale, political awareness, and community among displaced workers. Charles Seeger, then supervisor of its Special Skills Music Division, was directing the few assistants who were broadly canvassing the mountains and farmlands for sources. On December 4th, he wired a telegram to Sidney Robertson Cowell, who had been doing fieldwork in Appalachia and then the Ozarks and South, asking her to make every effort to complete Lomax's Dusenberry recordings. That unusual request reflected Emma's importance as a source singer. Heavy rains made the roads impassable, and then Cowell took ill, so that it was almost Christmas before she could make the journey with Lawrence Powell out to visit Emma and Ora. Cowell's skills with her equipment resulted in 43 remarkably clear, vibrant recordings for which she paid Emma day wages. They drove into Mina each day for the electric current to make the recordings. And over the 3 days she spent there, Cowell developed a warm rapport with Emma and concern for her survival through the winter. She dispatched a 5-page report to Seeger, writing that the 2-room cabin was poverty personified. The hens were not laying, the cow was dry, and there was no forage. The one window had no glass, and they were unable to buy oil for their one lamp. The roof leaked, and the walls were pasted over with newspapers. They owned no blankets. Before leaving, Cowell went down to Mina with $15 of her own money and brought back a month's supply of food, regretting that she couldn't do more. Here is a piece of the recording of Gilderoy. The real Gilderoy was a Scottish outlaw executed in 1636, and a version of the English street ballad was collected in 1893 by Lucy Broadwood.
I and Gildy both born in one town together. At 7 years old, we loved one another. Our fathers and our mothers too, both thinking of much joy, thinking of the wedding day of I and Gilderoy.
Despite her wealth of songs and stories, by the end of 1936, Emma and her daughter had lost their farm for want of rent or tax money and moved to an abandoned shack a few miles away. Emma said that they had it rent-free only because it would cost good money to fix it up to rent it. They lived in absorbing worry of the landlady's poor health and thought surely they would be evicted when she died. As Cowell wrote, experience had not led them to expect a long lease of life for anyone who did well by them. In 1934, Commonwealth College helped sharecroppers in Arkansas form the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. But it then met with increasingly harsh resistance until its forced closure in 1940. With the college's closing, a former instructor, Waldemar Heel, returned from Chicago where he was Dean of Music at Elmhurst College. He had visited Dusenberry before and came to see her again, bringing New York art teacher and photographer Sid Grossman. Heel showed his regard for Emma by buying her a much-needed cow. In 1940, former Commonwealth Drama Group leader Lee Hayes, together with Charles Seeger's son Pete, Woody Guthrie, and Millard Lampell, formed the Almanac Singers. In 1948, Hayes and Seeger went on to form the influential folk quartet, the Weavers. Both groups included songs collected from Mrs. Dusenberry in their albums and performances. Charles Seeger, his wife Ruth, and children Pete and Peggy also went on to carry several of Emma's songs to new listeners during the folk revival. Quite a few of her songs appear in the People's Songbook as well as in John and Allen Lomax's publications. Indeed, when I began to look for them, it was soon clear that many of Emma's songs are hiding in plain sight. Emma Dusenberry died on May 5, 1941, at age 79, and was buried beside her husband in Rocky Cemetery. Her short obituary in the Mina Weekly Star noted that she had a wonderful memory of happenings, and particularly did her mind retain the words and tunes of early-day folk songs. 45 years later, when Professor Cochrane went to Mina to speak to those who knew about Mrs. Dusenberry, he could not find one person or one piece of information in the library about her. As Professor Cochrane wrote in his article, Sweet Emma, the burial record in Mina has many spaces filled in with the word none. She had no social security number and no employer. In the space for occupation, the person started to write none again, but then thought better, crossed it out, and wrote in singer. It should have been her epitaph. Thank you.
Thank you, Nora. That was great, as always. Lovely. And what a amazing singer she really was, wasn't she?
Yes.
Yeah, I love that Barbara Allen festival. We do have time for a few questions if anybody wants to raise their hand. Nora, that phrase, all the songs in the world, was that a direct quote from Emma?
Yes.
So that, and you said that when? Sorry.
I believe she said that to Fletcher, who wrote it down in one of his writings about her, John Gould Fletcher.
Right. I think that's a great epitaph, isn't it? All the songs in the world.
Yes.
Lovely. But really distressing poverty.
Yeah.
I mean, that's astonishing, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's got their hand up. David has. Hi, David. Unmute. Yep.
Hi. Did her daughter Aura learn her songs from her mother?
Well, she probably learned a few of the songs, but there are a few recordings of Aura, but it's mainly recordings of children's songs and of animal calls on the farm, where she would call the animals. So there's no evidence that she had the same or a similar repertoire to her mother.
Interesting.
Yes, it's a shame.
Yeah.
Anne Lederman. Anne next.
Hi. So the first couple of songs you played were religious, and they sounded like they might have been Afro-American in origin. So I'm wondering if there's any information about what church she belonged to and whether those churches were integrated where she was, or how that might have worked.
Yes, well, she went to Methodist churches, but I think it's probably the most likely case that it was from when she was working with picking cotton and things like that, and I think that's probably mainly where she would learn songs like that.
Right.
Yes.
So so black sharecroppers and white
Yes.
sharecroppers would have worked together.
Yes, they did.
Situations. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Last question from Elizabeth. Lisa now.
Yes, you describe Emma as illiterate. How did she learn her child ballads as she began getting more and more interested in ballads? Did she learn them from other local informants, or did she know enough writing to be able to read them from printed texts? How do you think she acquired the ballads that she did learn?
She learned them from relatives and from neighbors who knew them. So at the end of a lot of them, she will name, I learned this from my Aunt Fanny Hayes back in Georgia, or something like that. So it was just from other people that she would learn it directly from. Yes.
Was she actually illiterate before she lost her son?
Well, she's described as illiterate quite often, so I don't have any evidence that she was necessarily before she went blind, but she was still fairly young when she did lose her sight.
Fine. But thank you, Nora. Another round of applause for Nora, because that really was excellent. We're very lucky to have her. Thank you, Nora. And if I remember rightly, was it Lawrence Powell that bought Emma a cow?
No, it was Waldemar Hill, who was an instructor at Commonwealth College.
Right. So this is our theme for this for today, for this evening, because John Baxter's now going to talk about 3 acres and a cow. So if Martin can bring cows into the last one later on, that would be rather neat. So over to you, John.
I've done everything except unmute myself. Can you see my screen, everybody?
Yes, we can.
Great. So I'm not going to talk about 200 songs, but I am going to talk about 20 or so songs. Almost all of them have the same title. They're either called 3 Acres and a Cow, or imaginatively a cow and 3 acres. When I started looking into this, I only knew one song of this title, and that was the one that was included in Roy Palmer's collection, The Painful Plough. If anyone doesn't know the book, I know a lot of you do. The Painful Plough tells the story of the lives of agricultural labourers in the 19th century using contemporary folk songs and ballads. It has a particular focus on the life of the agricultural trade union leader Joseph Arch. He was later a Liberal MP. And 3 Acres and a Cow, as we shall see, was a slogan used in the election of 1885. So that's the only version I knew of to start with. You may have, if you get a chance, Robin Gray, a Sheffield-based musician, and his friends do a show called 3 Acres and a Cow, where they explore the history of land rights and protests in the UK, and it's worth catching that if you can. But 2 other songs that I want to investigate that also are called 3 Acres and a Cow. I should say, sorry, the song in Roy Palmer's song is sung to a music hall tune called I Wish They'd Do It Now. Actually, I'm not going to try and sing the chorus to that song at the moment because my voice is not brilliant. I will try and sing later on. But a second song of that title comes through the oral tradition from Francis Shergold of Bampton Morris. And I thank you to John Howson for providing a high quality recording of this. I'll just play you a snatch of it now. Fairly substantial snatch. It's the first verse and chorus. Bear with me. Here we go.
We've toiled, my lass, both early and late to earn a frugal meal, while squire and farmer lived in state and crushed us neath their heel. But brighter days are coming, lass, to you and me I'll vow, and those who took us by the hand, 3 acres and a cow. Just think on that, my own dear wife, and soothe your careworn brow. Good fortune bring to you and them 3 acres and a cow.
So it's a fairly strident song, not entirely clear what it's about, but Francis had his own ideas. I'm just going to play you a brief snatch of an interview with him.
We've toiled, my lass, both early and late.
Bear with me. There we go.
So whether that's when there was some bad old days, well, like with a vote, no vote for the old serfs, I suppose, or whatever. I don't know really how that song came about. But Mother used to sing it quite a lot at one time.
So it's a song he got from his mother, who elsewhere he says his mother got it from his grandfather, which would put it in the late 19th century. And it's a song to do with agricultural workers and the vote, which is absolutely right, as we shall see. So that's the second song that I'm looking to try and trace the origins of, that I've been trying to trace the origins of. A third song, which again comes from a broadside, is reproduced on the right here, which starts, I'm only just a labourer, just agricultural, and it has a chorus which starts, and I've got 3 acres and a cow. I'm going to come back to that one fairly soon. But let's trying to find out where these songs come from. immediately reveals that there are loads of songs and poems of this title, and I'm going to explore them, not necessarily in the order that I found them, but in an order that attempts to make some sense and classify the different songs. So I'm going to talk about stage songs sung largely in the music halls. I'm going to talk about poems, which are hard to distinguish from songs which were published in newspapers and periodicals. I'm going to talk about formal election songs that were used in the election of 1885. And I'm going to talk about songs sung on demonstrations. But before I do all that, I need to say something about the 1885 election. It was the first after significant reforms had extended the franchise. For the first time, constituencies returned a single MP. For the first time, the majority of adult males could vote, and the number of voters increased from 3 million to 5.7 million. So it was almost doubling of the number of people eligible to vote. And both major parties, which were the Liberals and the Conservatives, were divided, internally divided as to how to respond. The Liberals rather more so. The populist Tories, based around Randolph Churchill and others. Randolph Churchill is pictured here with the big moustache on the left-hand side, whispering into the Marquis of Salisbury, the leaders of the Tory party's ear. The populist Tories launched the Primrose League, which was an attempt to build a mass membership organisation to support the Tory party and its aims. It was successful. By 1910, it had 2 million members. It was also meant to combat the rise of trade unions. It was the first one of the first mass political organisations to have women in leading roles, which we'll come back to. The Liberals were led by Gladstone, shown here holding the cards on the right-hand side, but they had a radical faction, largely based in Birmingham, led by Joseph Chamberlain and Jesse Collins, and the radical Liberals had their own programme, which was designed to appeal to newly enfranchised urban and rural workers, calling for slum clearance, disendowment of the Church of England, free schools, and significantly compulsory purchase powers to buy land for the creation of small holdings, a policy summarised as being 3 acres and a cow. And a great deal of the debate in the election revolved around the use of that phrase. Tory supporters dismissed it as a utopian demand. Chamberlain was derided as being untrustworthy and attempting to bribe the electorate. The Liberals narrowly won the election, but the balance of power was held by the Irish nationalists. Pictured, you see Charles Parnell in the middle here, and he was a leading Irish nationalist. The government lasted around, the Liberal government lasted around 6 months and then fell to bits when there was an attempt to do a deal with the Irish nationalists to bring in Irish Home Rule. Joseph Chamberlain and many of the other radical Liberals wouldn't stomach that. They left the Liberal Party, they became Liberal Unionists, and many of them later became, including Chamberlain, became part of Conservative Tory administrations. And it's, yeah, so moving on. So that's the big political picture. There were many that, well, one stage song, perhaps the best known one at the time, was written and sung by Arthur Lloyd. And on the Arthur Lloyd website, he has his own website, there is a version of the tune has been recorded. And so I'm going to sing you the chorus of that song. I've got 3 acres and a cow, and now I've got it, I don't know what I'll do with it now. The blooming cow, it worries me, it leads me such a rig. I wish that they would take it back and let me have a pig. Let me have a pig. Now, that was the third of the unknown songs, the broadside that we saw at the beginning. So we've identified at least one of them. The song was reproduced in street literature several times. Broadsides survive in several collections. It was printed by 3 different printers. It featured in Lloyd's repertoire for about a year, from the end of 1885 to the end of 1886. But it wasn't the only musical song. There were, in fact, at least 5. I'm only going to talk about 2, really. So, moving on. A second music hall song for which we don't have a picture of the sheet music, and I've not been able to access it because of the restrictions over the last while, was called sometimes Them 3 Acres of Land and a Cow, sometimes just 3 Acres of Land and a Cow. It was written by Oswald Allen, well known for writing pantomimes, with music by Alfred Lee, who was a very active in writing music for music hall songs. First line, my name's Tommy Turnip, and it has the chorus shown below, which I might attempt to sing in a minute, or not, as the case may be. Both music hall songs do something that many music hall songs do, which is use rural stereotypes to comic effect. Both display a great deal of cynicism about the promise of 3 acres and a cow, and the gullibility of anyone that might believe in land reform, and both make reference to radical liberal politicians in a sort of derisory sort of way. Joe Chamberlain, as he tends to be called, and they often refer to Charles Dilke, who was a disgraced radical liberal MP. But recently I've come across an article which shows that there was a second version of the song by Oswald Allen and Alfred Lee that was circulating, which was dedicated to Joseph Chamberlain MP. There's some evidence that it was perhaps, I don't entirely trust the dating, but it is dated on some websites as being published in 1889, which puts it about 3 or 4 years later, by which time Chamberlain was stressing the nationalistic and imperialistic side of his politics a great deal more, and was in the process in the music halls of ceasing to be the target of humour, and instead, by the late 1890s, there were many more songs in praise of him. But if you see the chorus of that song, you may recognise it.
A cow, just think on that, my own dear wife, and soothe your careworn brow. Good fortune bring to you and them 3 acres and a cow.
So the Francis Shergold song seems to derive, at least the chorus of it does, from this, the revised version of the Oswald Allen and Alfred Lee song, which I believe was probably sung to the same music as the earlier song sung by Harry Liston. To find the lyrics of songs when you can't always access the sheet music, sometimes you have to go in by the back door. And newspapers, local and national, and periodicals publish loads of verse, loads of poems. And the distinction between poems and songs was not always clear. Poems were often written with an air so that they could be a tune, so that they could be sung. And quite often you find in newspapers, you find the actual music hall song reproduced as verse, but with the authorship stripped off. And in fact, that's how I found a complete version of the lyrics to the earlier version of the Oswald Allen song. But the verse often, there are endless parodies. There are 6 volumes of parodies collected by Walter Hamilton in the late 19th century. Each contains, I reckon, at least 1,000 poems. So there are thousands and thousands of parodies of well-known poems. I'm not going to read out the Promised Land because I don't have time. That's a parody of a Felicia Hemans poem. But I will read out 3 Acres and a Cow, again, that same title, It's an anonymous verse published in the Hampshire and Portsmouth Telegraph. Right. Our parson says I's ignorant and cannot write my name. And that is true, but if I is, who is the one to blame? I know if I could read and write and cipher anyhow, I'd try and find out all about 3 acres and a cow. I went to hear a lecture too. Our parson took the chair. The squire and all the country folk and magistrates was there. I stood behind my betters as I stands behind my plough, and there they all brought up again, 3 acres and a cow. Some ladies who was in the room wore yellow petticoats. They called them Primrose Dames, I think, as went about for votes. One come to me with smiles and tracts and told me that as how one tract among them was all about 3 acres and a cow. I fancy, though I may be wrong, that somehow it may be, some other folk have puzzled been almost as much as me. And maybe it is but a craze that's all the rage just now, a figment of the Tory brain, 3 acres and a cow. So that again is influenced by the sort of music hall style of verse, of song, which both mocks the rural worker, but also has a sneaking admiration for their native wisdom. But in searching for songs in this period, you quite often find them published as poems in local and national newspapers. But at the same time, these local and national newspapers and other periodicals were publishing things called election songs. Sometimes they seem to have been written by enthusiastic amateurs, sometimes by people more closely involved in the campaigns. And if you do a quick and dirty search for the term election songs in the British Library's British Newspaper Archive, you see that particularly in the last 25 years of the 19th century, there are large peaks in mention around the general election. Election songs played a big part in electioneering at that time. They were usually sung to well-known tunes like John Brown's Body, Harks of Oak, Tramp, Tramp, Tramp. You'll see, I'm tempted to sing it, but I won't. The Grand Old Man, which is a Liberal song, whose air is the minstrel boy, a particularly stirring song. But many songs were also written, and the music was written to be sung in political meetings and as part of political campaigning. And you can see on the right-hand side a review in a newspaper of an election song written by Reginald J. Thompson, and it's clear it's being thought about. It's highly effective. It does not make any undue demands on the power of the vocalist, the range being from B to A only. It may be sung with effect by a chorus of mixed voices, a happy satire on Mr. Joseph Chamberlain's bribe to the people. So it's not just the politics that's being thought through. People are consciously thinking about how best to write an election song that will be sung by the people. But other songs were, I wanted to touch on songs and chants of disorder. These come to us secondhand through reports of newspapers that are often very unsympathetic to the demonstrators, but not always. Elections in the 19th century as a whole tended to be often quite violent events, and death and disorder was relatively common linked to elections, and noise and singing was part of the violence. And often you will find that youths would be drowning out speakers they didn't like by singing the hits of the day, the music hall songs. But in this particular election, there seemed to be an inordinate number of people singing chants to the tune of Auld Lang Syne, along the lines of, well, 3 acres and a cow, my boy, 3 acres and a cow. We'll kick the Liberals out of town, 3 acres and a cow. And I wanted to read you a report, which I found slightly amusing, of what happened in Brackley, which is very close to one of in Northampton, where I grew up. This is the count night, the result night. Brackley was on Saturday night the scene of most extraordinary excitement Thomas Judge, a leading radical and strong advocate of 3 acres and a cow, had rendered himself particularly obnoxious to the Conservative Party, as well as to many of his own political associates. By a singular coincidence, a cow belonging to Mr. George died on Saturday morning, a short time before the news of Sir Reynolds' success. The opportunity was too good to be lost, and some practical jokers on the Conservative side brought the skin, which they stuffed with straw, and placed the animal on poles. In the evening, it was carried shoulder high by a procession amounting to many hundreds, who sang the election song, 3 acres and a cow, my boys, to the tune of Auld Lang Syne. The residents of Mr. Judge and other leading Liberals were in turn visited amongst roars of laughter from the throng. The whole proceedings were of the most good-humoured description, the joke being too good to arouse ire even among Mr. Judge's supporters. The cow was afterwards burnt publicly. That from a Tory newspaper, the same event reported in a Liberal newspaper has the cow being stolen, killed, stuffed with straw, and Liberals and the Tory mob parading through the town, burning the cow in effigy. But just to return to my 3 initial songs, I think I've to the best of my ability and without being able to access the sheet music yet, I think I've identified 2 of the 3, but the one which remains, which we know least about, is the one that was started with by Roy Palmer. I think one of the, no, I think I better stop there. Yeah, so that's, I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope I haven't bored you all with my distraction of 19th century politics.
That was great, John. Thank you. That's typical of the working classes. You offer them a cow and they say, I'd rather have a pig. I like that bit. That's the best bit in it. Anybody want to comment? And thank you, John. You finished on time, perfectly on time as well. Anybody want to bring up anything? Anybody? No. Ah, yes. Tim.
Hi. Well, yes, thank you very much for that. I was wondering, with these songs and also perhaps political songs in general, how long-lasting are they within, I'm guessing, particularly the oral tradition after the events that they're satirizing? Do they disappear quite quickly, or do some of them kind of find a life of their own beyond those events?
I think the vast majority of them disappear quite quickly, because particularly if they're very specific. I also should say that the ones we have records of tend to be the ones either that are supporting the Conservatives or that are supporting the mainstream Liberals, not the radical Liberals. And in fact, it's no, I don't think it's a coincidence that the songs that do survive from the radical tradition come from street literature and from the oral tradition, and are not in the newspapers, which are full of hundreds of songs and verses, but very few of them are sympathetic to the land reform cause. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
And Arthur next.
Thank you. Just as a matter of information, really, the slogan 3 acres and a cow was coined by a man called Eli Hampshire, and Jesse Collins is the one that mostly gets the credit for it. There is a biography of him and a republication of his book, which is, I don't know if you can see that. It's
yeah.
3 Acres and a Cow, The Life and Works of Eli Hampshire. And there's a reprint, there's a biography of him in the first part of the book, and a reprint of his book, The Source of England's Greatness and the Source of England's Poverty. And the slogan and his ideas of 3 acres and a cow are included in that. So just out of interest, really.
Yes,
so
thanks
thank you
for
very
that.
much for the presentation.
I should have said that as part of the presentation. The phrase itself does come from Eli Hampshire. Yeah.
Thank you, Arthur. Conrad. Unmute, Conrad. Unmute.
Got it.
That's it.
I think you can hear me now.
Yeah.
When you're talking about elections and the celebrations or other things, elections were violent times in New York, for example, for Pope's Day, which is Guy Fawkes in America. They were violent because the kids knew that the policemen were all at the election hall guarding it. So they went out and they did the continuation of Guy Fawkes' street stuff. That went there. The fireworks went to the 4th of July, and Halloween went, or the guising went to the kids in the streets of New York City, called the I put it in the chat. But when you think about violence in elections, it might be something else.
Thank you. Thank you, Conrad. Last question from Lisa.
Yeah. John, in this country, a very important slogan prior to the Civil War was really more than a slogan. It was a promise that was never honored. So it still remains very resonant today. Was a promise to enslaved African Americans that they would be given 40 acres and a mule. So 40 acres and a mule became a very, very popular slogan over here. I wondered, have you ever explored that trope between 3 acres and a cow and 40 acres and a mule? I mean, do you think it's just happenstance, or do you think there was actually a currency of, since there was so much activity between abolitionists, especially from the north of England and America, that they brought perhaps some of their songs and slogans with them that got incorporated into the American rhetoric? But it would have been back before the Civil War that the slogan would have gained currency.
I think there are parallels, and contemporary reports do show that both radicals and conservatives drew comparisons between the 40 acres and a mule and the 3 acres and a cow. I think it might reflect similarities in the political situation, in that there was, in this country at least, it was discomfort about huge political change, about the urbanization of the working classes. The distance from the land made it a popular slogan. I think there are probably different things involved in America, and I appreciate that it's a very it's still a slogan today, 40 acres and a mule. There are links. I think it'd be worth exploring further, but perhaps I haven't done enough work to comment on that in any depth.
In America, it was Reconstruction period after the Civil War.
Sure.
Right, but the promise was made prior to the Civil War, and Reconstruction carried on after that.
Okay, thank you. We'll have to stop with the 3 acres now, but I'm counting on you, Martin, to find a cow somewhere in the next 20 minutes or so. So over to Martin and Sean for the third paper of today.
Okay. Right. Well, I'm sorry to be a disappointment to you, Steve.
Oh, Lord.
I couldn't find a cow. I've been through everything very carefully, and I found some sheep, a hog, and several deer, and a few other things, but no cow in general. But just watch out for the Jersey. Okay. Thank you. At the July meeting, I talked about Sabin Baring-Gould's rough copy manuscript, one of the 2 manuscripts that he gave to Plymouth Library in his lifetime. And today I'm going to tell you about Working Notebook One, formerly known as Plymouth Notebook One. This was a late comer to the Plymouth collection, since it didn't arrive at the library until 32 years after Baring-Gould's death. It was one of several hundred items that belonged to Francis George Stainforth Nicol, who'd been Sabin Baring-Gould's #1 fan. Born in 1871 in Jersey, the old one, not the new one, Nicole was a friend of Arthur Baring-Gould, Sabin's younger stepbrother, and like Arthur, he was an Anglo-Catholic churchman. Nicole had met Sabin while visiting Arthur at Lew Trenchard and was greatly impressed by him, and he decided to form a collection of everything that Baring-Gould had written, and he very nearly succeeded. Nicole was a priest for 60 years, serving initially as domestic chaplain to Viscount Halifax before he became the vicar of St Thomas, Bethnal Green in 1925. Like much of that part of London, his church was badly damaged by bombing during the Second World War, and it was decided not to rebuild it. The parish was combined with neighbouring St Peter's in 1951, and Nicole's ministry ended, giving him more time to collect and study Baring-Gould's work. He was the first to compile a bibliography of Baring-Gould's publications. Having built his own collection, he then went on to help Baring-Gould's son Edward to fill in gaps in the Baring-Gould family library and to create a collection of Sabin's magazine articles. There are a number of letters from booksellers and publishers in Nicole's collection, showing us how diligently he hunted for elusive books and articles. There are also letters to Edward Baring-Gould, telling him about his discoveries and seeking permission to buy an item for him. The material found by Nicole for the Baring-Gould family is with Sabin's papers at the Devon History Centre at Exeter. Now, when Nicole died in 1955, he left Plymouth Library more than 400 books and articles by Baring-Gould, as well as manuscript copies of several others. This was very important to the library, which you may recall from my last talk, had lost 70,000 books to enemy bombing in 1941, including many of those written by Baring-Gould. The notebook was among the items Nicole bequeathed to the library. We can only speculate as to how Nicole obtained this notebook of folk songs, but its survival is a lucky accident, as it is an important record from the first few months of Baring-Gould's song collecting project. The material recorded in the notebook is a mixture of neat transcripts of songs, together with some rough penciled notation and some music. There are also a number of items, including letters and song or music manuscripts, which are pasted into the book or loose inside it. My assessment of the document is that Baring-Gould started it in September 1888, when he began in earnest to collect songs, and that it was intended to be a fair copy of the songs that he collected. While preparing songs for publication in the first 2 volumes of Songs and Ballads of the West, he used it for editing songs, though many of those edited versions never actually appeared in print. I believe that he abandoned this approach at some point in 1889 and started a new fair copy, and he then used this notebook for rough work, notes, and occasionally as a field notebook. So let's have a look at the book. If I can just share my screen successfully. There we go. I hope you can see that. If not, complain to the management. Right, so fairly ordinary looking hardback notebook with lined cream paper, similar to several of the other notebooks that he used. At some stage, the pages have been numbered up to 123, so this is a relatively small manuscript. Give that a moment. If we press on, you see that someone, not me, has helpfully labelled it Plymouth Notebook One, which is the name I gave it when we were working on the microfiche. The change to Working Notebook One, I think we can blame Steve for that, was made when the whole manuscript collection was put onto the VWML website. Someone on the Plymouth Library staff prepared a neat list of the songs in the notebook, and then a later hand has added page numbers to this and made a few corrections. If we pass through a page with a totally irrelevant ecclesiastical reminder, we come to the first song in the book, and it's not a great surprise that this is a version of Widdicombe Fair, though William Collier, the man who sent it to Baring-Gould, called it Tom Pierce, Tom Pierce. Baring-Gould received it on the 15th of September 1888, and this is a neat copy in Baring-Gould's hand of Collier's text and tune. And this is the version of Widdicombe Fair that Baring-Gould published in Songs of the West, though without the cod dialect, and which is now the version that everybody knows, and I can't resist singing it, can I, Sian?
Of course not.
Tom Pierce, lend me your grey mare, all along, down, along, out, along Lee, for I want to go over to Widdicombe Fair, with Bill Brewer, Jan Stewart, Peter Davy, Daniel Whidden, Harry Hawke, old Uncle Tom Cobley and all, old Uncle Tom Cobley and all. So that's Tom Cobley. We'll ignore the Somersetshire song and the Tramp song, and I'd like to just have a quick look at Sweet Nightingale. This is one of the songs from Robert Bell's Ancient Poems, Ballads and Songs of the Peasantry of England that Baring-Gould mentioned in his letter to the local newspapers dated 20th of September 1888. This is Bell's text, but the tune on the verso page is that sent to him by Edward Stevens of St Ives a few days later. This is the version that Baring-Gould published and which is now widely sung. It's even been translated into Cornish. Stevens' original letter with the notation has survived elsewhere in Baring-Gould's collection. So the next few pages in the notebook are also texts copied from Bell. And I'll just note that, I don't hope you can see my mouse, but here you can see a little pencil mark added later, Old Parsons. Not a reference to ancient clerical gentlemen, but to one of his earliest and most prolific singers, James Parsons, who he must have heard sing this song. He's left the verso page blank in each case, probably to let him add a tune or other notes when he obtained them. And on page 14, this space has a manuscript text for the Jolly Wagoner pasted onto it, though there's no clear indication of its source, and it's not the same as the text on the recto page. Then, a little further on, we have Thomasine Ennis, and this is a song written by Baring-Gould himself. He included it in the first part of Songs of the West in 1889 as number 13, with a tune written by Henry Fleetwood Shepherd, but it was dropped from the 1891 version and replaced by a real folk song. Page 26. We have, oh, that's not right. I've lost it. Oops. Page 26 has disappeared. Maybe I accidentally deleted it. Let's go instead to page 27, Jolly Fellows That Follow the Plough. And here you can see a double page set of texts for that has no note or title to it, but this is the first of the songs in the notebook that was collected rather than sent in. And here you can see Baring-Gould at work actually editing a song. There are 8 verses here on the recto page that look as if they might be the original notation from Robert Hard of South Brent. But then alongside this, you've got an alternative sets of stanzas which appear to be a rewriting of those lyrics. Then on the verso page, a neat copy which appears to have further alterations. Now, Baring-Gould never actually published this song, and the version in his personal copy manuscript is probably a composite of that collected from Hard and another South Brent singer. Here we have the Bonny Bunch of Roses, And this song is fascinating because of the way that Beringald became obsessed with the idea that it was a descendant of a Jacobite song. And this spread indicates his first attempt to reconstruct the song to bring in Prince Charlie, rather than Bonaparte. Later in the notebook, there are further efforts to do this, but he actually gave up on this when he wanted to publish a version in Songs of the West, though the text that he did publish was slightly ambiguous in that it mentioned neither man by name. This, like many other items in the book, does need further study. Here we have on the verso page the Jolly Sportsman. If I make it just a tad larger. No, I can't apparently do that. That means no. Oh, that's strange. There are limitations to what you can do in Zoom with this thing. But here by the title, it says, Nasty One, to be rewritten. And it is indeed. This is a tale of a young woman tricking a knight into acknowledging his illegitimate child. And this would indeed have tested Baring-Gould, which makes it all the more surprising that he sent it to the notoriously prudish Francis Child. Though it appears again in some of the later notebooks, he couldn't bring himself to include it in the personal copy or fair copy manuscripts, and it was never published. I'm going to go out of this for a minute because for some reason it stopped working, so bear with me. I'll just stop the share. Sorry about this, folks. That's better. Okay, share again. Okay, so Jolly Sportsman, and then several versions of that. And then we come to a group of 4 songs, starting with The Miller's Last Will, which are from the South Brent singers James Helmore and Robert Hard, who are among the first singers that Baring-Gould met. Now, the version on page 36, the verso page, was certainly came from Baring-Gould's host in South Brent, Charles Spence Bate, and that is almost certainly in his handwriting, which means that he was the one who actually copied out these other versions of songs from South Brent from John Helmore and Robert Hard, and this is Robert Hard's version of The Miller, or possibly John Helmore, who was himself a miller. So all of these with the music probably noted down by either Bussell or Fleetwood Shepherd and added in as well, and several songs from that time. Just ignore those and go on to The Northern Cat, or The Outlandish Cat. And this is the first example of a song taken from another of Baring-Gould's first singers, James Parsons. I've asked myself many times whether he really sang The Northern Cat rather than Night, or whether this was a dental malfunction. Baring-Gould heard the song from him on other occasions and collected more verses, and he also heard it from other singers, but he never published a version of The Outlandish Night. From this point in the manuscript, we've got several more songs collected from Parsons, Hard, Helmore, and some other singers that Baring-Gould heard very early in the project. And most of these appear to be fair copies from field notation, which of course we don't have. So I'm going to skip ahead to page 100 and it's quite a big skip. Oh, there we go. And here on the verso page, you can see a very untidily written text of a song without a title or any note, but which begins as "I was walking one day down by the riverside." And I believe that this is actually a field record. I said to you that at some point in 1889, Beringald began a new fair copy notebook and started to use this one for other purposes, including field notation, using the blank, mainly verso pages that he'd left. So this song is a version of Round 564, Down by the Riverside, also known as 14 Years of Age, and you might guess that the subject matter was such that Baring-Gould never produced a fair copy or printed it. Here at the bottom of page 104, we have a list of songs in 2 columns, and I recognise this as being the set list for 2 concerts that Baring-Gould organised in January 1889. The one in South Brent has got at least, although he never actually seems to have completed the list, he had the Miller's Last Will as one of the items in the South Brent concert, not in Tavistock, but that is good because that was collected from either James Helmore or Robert Hard in South Brent, and the 2 old men were in the audience, and in fact Baring-Gould made sure that they got part of the proceeds from the door take for the concert, so that was a good evening out. Pages 107 to 109, there's this list of songs, starts in fact on the following page and runs back down to 100, although if you look closely you'll see there's something wrong with the numbering. The ambition was to get to 100. Beringald wasn't ever so good with numbers, and I think that this is a record of the songs that Beringald had collected at a particular point in time, probably around the end of 1888, as he wrote in December of that year that he'd collected 90 songs since September. So that's another little project for me sometime to sort that out. Moving on, here we have another rough text, almost certainly a field text. And we know from other sources that this is the Gown of Green, and that it was collected in March 1891. So since that is beyond the date of most of the stuff in the book, this supports my theory about the change of use of the manuscript. And then here we have another go at the Bunch of Roses, attempting to convert it to a Jacobite song. Then up spake Charles Edward. Not a good idea, Sabin. Then moving on a bit further, here we have a couple of lists on the top right here. This list of 13 items numbered is part of the planning for the first part of Songs of the West, which was published, actually appeared in the bookshops in February 1889. So he was moving quite fast at this stage, and that is the correct order in which the songs appear in the book. Over here we have another list of songs, and this is more of a puzzle, not least because some of the songs mentioned are not to be found in the rest of the collection. I've never found, for example, the Loyal Sons of Britain anywhere in the collection yet. Page 122, another gathering of lists, in this case set lists for concerts. But if you look carefully, and if the resolution of your screen is good enough, you can see the drawing of a building behind the text. Now, that with the notation of Harvest Home concludes the material in the notebook, apart from some manuscript items that were loose in the book that have been numbered to follow on from the pages. I'll just have a quick look at those. We've got a version of the Dilly song without a source. Then the Lamerton Hunt song, which is actually a song written words and music by Sabine Baring-Gould, possibly the arrangement as well, although it's not quite clear on that. I'll have to check the sheet music. There's a letter from Henry Fleetwood Shepherd from June 1889 about their difference of opinion on Red Rosy Morn. But it also draws Sabine's attention to Davis Gilbert's book, Ancient Christmas Carols. There's a letter from Reginald Kelly about Squire Kelly. And this is a letter from Anne Gibbons, who provided the copy of Cold Blows the Wind that had somehow mysteriously disappeared earlier. And Beringald had written back to her seeking more details of the singer, which she gave. She was Elizabeth Doidge and had formerly been one of their nurses. But she also told him, actually, it's a shame you didn't remember, but I am the widow of one of your old friends. So he lost a few points there. A letter from Thomas Chegwidden, who had sent him a copy of the book about Helston Furry Day. And Sackville H. Barclay told him about going to a ringer's supper at Oakford in North Devon, where he heard Peter Cheriton sing a version of the Raggle Taggle Gypsies. And there is a fuller text and tune in the personal copy, which suggests that Barclay had obtained more from him, or that Baring-Gould visited Cheriton. And then we have these two letters from 1799 and 1819 to Baring-Gould's grandfather, which have nothing to do with the folk song collection at all. So that's a very rapid trip through a book that contains many puzzles, and it gives us some insight into Baring-Gould's activity in those early days of collecting. We know from what he said to Francis Child and others that at the time he valued the tunes more than the words. He did change his views later on, and there's some evidence that his later work is a much more accurate reflection of what he'd heard. But we don't have the original field texts that confirm this. And these few examples of what appear to be field notation are just the few samples that we do have available, just a few other scraps. So there are still 3 other working notebooks that need study, each of which, like this one, a fair copy before it was reused for other purposes and later replaced by the personal copy and the fair copy. And my hope is that by looking more closely at these notebooks and the final versions as they appear in those larger works, I'll eventually come to understand Baring-Gould's editing process better, should I live that long. Thank you very much indeed. That's it.
Here, Martin, and save it. And ladies and gentlemen, if anybody knows the whereabouts of page 26, was it? If they could send it back to Martin, please.
Yeah.
It is astonishing, though. I mean, is Baring-Gould, have we got more stuff about Baring-Gould than any other collector? I mean, it seems that this sort of detective work is not possible with most of them.
There's an awful lot. I really don't know. I've said before, I think it's a shame that no one has really laid out Cecil Sharp's work to quite the same extent. But I do think Baring-Gould, although Baring-Gould collected fewer songs than Sharp, although he was well on the way to do it. I mean, Sharp collected, what, 5,000 songs. Baring-Gould, I think if we ever get to a final number, it'll be somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500, so about half as many songs. But there is a lot of manuscript material, not all of it about songs, of course. And we know that cartloads of stuff were taken from his house after he died, and taken up to the local quarry and burned. It's possible that this book that Nicole had survived that, because we know that locals did pick up some items on the edge of the fire and take them home. So that's a possible route, but no way of proving that. And of course, there was a huge book sale in the 1930s that ran over 3 days, selling off items from his library. And still, there are probably something like 7,000 books altogether in Baring-Gould's library. So there's an awful lot of stuff to work with, and it sometimes feels very lonely doing it all on my own.
Well, we're all very glad you're doing it. And Lisa's got a question. Lisa? Unmute, Lisa.
I'm fascinated. I come to Baring-Gould as a singer who was always cautioned to realize by other singers more knowledgeable than me that Baring-Gould heavily edited the materials he published. Most singers were concerned about the amount of material that he considered improper or naughty that he edited out of his texts. But I was fascinated. So for me, it was very revealing to see what a careful collector in many ways he was, and the stuff that in his notebooks, he obviously tried to record and transcribe as carefully as he could what it was that he was collecting. Now, in this process of editing, which I think is a really brilliant idea to go into how he edited, I couldn't help but notice, as you describe, his efforts to sort of either rework or reestablish the Bonnie Bunch of Roses as a Jacobite song, and perhaps his own biases towards British nationalism that would have been repelled by the glorification of Napoleon and some of the Napoleonic songs. How guided do you think he was by, in terms of what he published, by his own, what do you think motivated him? And was he trying to create a national song? Was he trying to establish certain values as British values? Have you gotten to that point of sort of conjecturing about what motivated him as an editor in his published work?
Well, I think we have to see him first as an antiquarian, and first equal as a storyteller. You put those two together, you've got quite an unusual combination. And, you know, of the 1,200 plus books and articles that he wrote, only a relative few are actually about folk song, though he did think of his work on folk songs being the most important thing that he'd done. And yes, there was a message, although it didn't clarify into a campaign for English folk song until he got together with Sharp. And then the two of them cooked up this idea, you know, I suspect Sharp actually influenced Baring-Gould slightly towards that, as Baring-Gould influenced Sharp in other ways, although it is quite hard to tell. Now, the question of Bonaparte and the Jacobite, you know, as it goes into the Bonnie Bunch of Roses, he certainly was a Napoleon fan. He wrote a massive book about Napoleon, which is down on my shelves downstairs, and which I doubt whether Sian could carry up here for me. It's so big. She gave it to me for my birthday once, and I thought I'd won a major prize, you know. So he actually did like Napoleon. He admired Napoleon. But I think his vision of Bonnie Bunch of Roses being a Jacobite song was something about the style of the tune that either he or Fleetwood Shepherd had picked up. It's something that was driven by the tune rather than by the words, which he did collect more versions of later on, but he thought this is a Jacobite tune. I don't know why he thought that. a musicologist would no doubt be able to tell me. And whether he was right or not, do we know? Is there a... and one of the other things he said was that there was a broadside ballad from early in the 19th century of Bonnie Bunch of Roses, which said to be sung to the bunch of roses. And that might have been another thing that he took as a clue.
Martin, I think it was the Bonnie Bunch of Rushes was the tune. It's an Irish tune. And the song Bonnie Bunch of Roses was written to be sung to the tune Bonnie Bunch of Rushes.
Yeah, Baring-Gould actually has it as being to the bunch of roses. So obviously that I agree. It's almost certainly related to the bunch of rushes. Yeah, I don't quarrel with that.
I think we're running out of time. Sorry, Lisa, did you want? No, you're muted anyway. I think we're running out of time, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you again to our wonderful, excellent speakers this afternoon or this evening. Round of applause for all three of them. And we'll see you again, I hope, on Wednesday for Forgotten Martin again on Forgotten Songs of the Upper Thames. And then again, we'll see you again on the 31st of October for a non-Halloween themed, I don't think there'll be any Halloween in it at all, session from Sam, Bob and Derek. So thanks for coming. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.